USS Astoria, or the Nasty Asty as her crew knew her, played a significant role in the early battles of the Pacific War. Named in honor of the city of Astoria, Oregon, she stood by and protected the vital U.S. carriers during victories in the Coral Sea and at Midway, before being swept up in one of the most chaotic and deadliest nights in the history of the United States Navy, the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942. Her crew fought heroically during the battle and afterward to save their ship. But Astoria succumbed to her damage and became one of the first U.S. vessels to lie at the bottom of what would become known as Iron Bottom Sound. Astoria's keel was laid down on September 1, 1930, at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. She was the first ship of her class to be laid down, but ended up being the second ship launched as delays in her construction enabled New Orleans to be the first. Astoria wasn't built on a traditional slipway, but rather in a dry dock at the Puget Sound Yard. In this photo, the dry dock is being flooded in December 1933 in preparation for her launching and christening. Another interesting fact about her launching ceremonies is that 11 days prior to them, Prohibition was repealed in the United States, and Astoria became the first U.S. Navy ship to be christened with a champagne bottle in the post-Prohibition era. Astoria had an overall length of 588 feet, a beam of almost 62 feet, and had a standard displacement of 10,000 tons. She was equipped with a main battery of 9 8-inch 55 caliber Mark IX guns, which were housed in 3 triple turrets, a super-firing pair forward and a lone turret aft. Her guns had a maximum range of almost 32,000 yards, or over 18 miles, when elevated to their maximum elevation of 41 degrees. For air defense, she was equipped with 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns that were arranged in open single mounts amidships and 850 caliber Browning machine guns. Her class was noteworthy for its increase in armor protection over previous U.S. cruiser designs, which were somewhat lacking in that department. Her hull was 12 feet shorter than the preceding Northampton class, and the weight savings that came from this reduction in size allowed for an increase in main belt armor to a thickness of 5 inches. Deck armor was upped as well to 2.25 inches, and for the first time, it was believed that a U.S. cruiser design had sufficient barbette and turret armor to withstand the 8-inch shell fire of their contemporaries. Astoria's turret faces had 8 inches of armor plating. 2.75 inches protected their sides, and 1 inch protected their roofs. Barbette and conning tower armor was increased as well to 5 inches. Astoria was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers, which provided the steam for her 4-geared turbines and was rated for 107,000 shaft horsepower. She had a top speed of 32 knots and had a range of 9,000 nautical miles when cruising at 10 knots. At the time of her commissioning, she was manned by 104 officers and 795 enlisted men. Astoria was commissioned into the United States Navy on April 28, 1934, under the command of Captain Edmund S. Root. She conducted a lengthy shakedown cruise during the summer months of 1934, in which she voyaged extensively throughout the Pacific. In addition to the Hawaiian Islands, she also visited Samoa, Fiji, Australia, and New Caledonia before returning to San Francisco in late September. Between the fall of 1934 and February 1937, she operated with Cruiser Division 7 of the Scouting Force and was based at San Pedro, California. Astoria was reassigned to Cruiser Division 6, still within the Scouting Force, in February of 1937, and she continued to train and patrol off the West Coast. Like the other elements of the U.S. Navy during the interwar years, the culmination of her training came every year in the annual fleet problems that brought the entire United States fleet together for a simulated war game. After the conclusion of Fleet Problem 20 in late February 1939, Astoria steamed for Norfolk, where she took on stores and fuel before heading to Annapolis, Maryland, where she embarked the remains of the Japanese ambassador to the United States, Saito Hiroshi, who had passed away in late February. Astoria was to return Hiroshi to Japan, a gesture that expressed America's gratitude to the Japanese for returning the body of the United States ambassador to Japan, Edgar A. Bancroft, in one of their warships in 1925. Astoria departed Annapolis on March 18th and, after stops in Panama and Honolulu, arrived in Yokohama Harbor on April 17th. She fired a 21-gun salute, which was returned by the light cruiser Kiso. Astoria's men carried Hiroshi's ceremonial urn ashore that afternoon. After a solemn state funeral the following morning, the Japanese showered lavish hospitality on the visiting cruiser and her men. Captain Richmond K. Turner, who would soon obtain the rank of Rear Admiral and go on to command several major task forces during the Pacific War, for his part, pleased Ambassador to Japan Joseph C. Grew by his diplomatic role in the proceedings. The naval attaché in Tokyo, Captain Harold M. Bemis, later recorded that the choice of Turner for that delicate mission was, quote, particularly fortunate. Astoria got underway on April 26th and made stops in Shanghai, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Guam on her way to San Francisco. On the final leg of her journey, she aided in the search for famed author and adventurer Richard Halliburton, who was missing after he had attempted to sail from Hong Kong to San Francisco in his Chinese junk Sea Dragon. Astoria combed more than 152,000 square miles of the Pacific before she ended the search on May 29th and headed for San Francisco. In October 1939, Astoria shifted her home port to Pearl Harbor when she was assigned to the Hawaiian detachment of the Scouting Force. She trained and maneuvered in Hawaiian waters until being dispatched to the Mare Island Navy Yard for an overhaul in April 1941. During this overhaul, she received several quadruple mounts of 1.1-inch 75 caliber anti-aircraft guns, and a pedestal was fitted atop her foremast in anticipation of the installation of a new air search radar. With the work completed, Astoria returned to Pearl Harbor in late July. Astoria operated in Hawaiian waters into early September before escorting a convoy bound for Manila and Guam. Upon her return to Pearl Harbor, she spent the final 5 weeks of peace, training and patrolling around Oahu. Astoria put to sea on December 5, 1941, with Task Force 12, which was built around the aircraft carrier Lexington, to deliver Marine aircraft to Midway Island. On the 7th, when news came of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Astoria was 700 miles west of Hawaii. Their mission was abruptly canceled, and Task Force 12 spent the next several days searching southwest of Oahu for the Japanese before returning to Pearl Harbor on the 13th. Astoria then covered the Wake Island Relief Force before the mission was canceled, after the island fell to the Japanese on December 23rd. After arriving back at Pearl Harbor on the 29th, Astoria was underway again on the morning of December 31st, this time with Task Force 11 built around the carrier Saratoga. Their time at sea would be brief, however, as on January 11th, Saratoga was hit by a torpedo and had to limp back to Pearl Harbor. After a brief rest at Pearl, Astoria stood out once again with Task Force 11, this time built around Lexington, to conduct an offensive patrol northeast of the Kingman Christmas Island line. After a planned strike on Wake Island had to be canceled due to fuel shortages, Astoria returned to Pearl on the 24th. On February 16th, Astoria got underway with Task Force 17, which was built around the carrier Yorktown. On March 6th, Task Force 17 rendezvoused with Task Force 11 to attack the Japanese base at Rabaul, but plans soon changed when the Japanese landed troops at Lae and Salamaua on New Guinea. As the carriers made their way to the southern coast of New Guinea to launch a strike on the Japanese beachheads, Astoria and the heavy cruisers Chicago, Louisville, and HMAS Australia, along with 4 destroyers, detached to operate in the waters south of the Louisiade archipelago, where they could secure the carrier's right flank during their operations in the Gulf of Papua, while also shielding Port Moresby from a possible attack. The raid was a resounding success and helped to delay Japanese efforts, at least for the time being. Astoria rejoined Task Force 17 on March 14th and patrolled the Coral Sea for the rest of the month. At sea continuously since February 16th, and running low on provisions, she was sent to replenish at Noumea, and arrived along with Portland on April 1st. Both cruisers returned to sea the following day, and Task Force 17 patrolled the Coral Sea for the next 2 weeks before heading to Tongatabu, where the force spent a week replenishing and resting. Task Force 17 returned to sea on April 27th and rendezvoused with Task Force 11 in the eastern Coral Sea early on the morning of May 1st. Something was brewing, and the men of Astoria could feel it. She screened Yorktown on the 4th as her air crews struck enemy shipping off Tulagi. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher at first considered sending Astoria and Chester to finish the cripples off with shellfire, but decided against it and kept his force intact in anticipation of further action. Astoria screened Yorktown on the 7th as her planes joined those from Lexington in searches and strikes that located and sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho. The U.S. carriers launched their aircraft again early on the morning of May 8th. Almost simultaneously, planes from Yorktown and Lexington attacked the enemy task force as Japanese planes began their attack on the U.S. carriers. Astoria's after-action report for May 8, 1942, which was written by her executive officer, Commander Chauncey R. Crutcher, recounted, "The action was short and was accompanied by intense anti-aircraft fire against a determined enemy. Astoria put up a protective barrage over Lexington at the outset, and then, after the task forces separated, she shifted her anti-aircraft barrage over Yorktown. Her gunners claimed to have splashed at least 4 enemy planes in the attack that seemed to end as suddenly as it had started. That afternoon, the battle damage Lexington had incurred led to several catastrophic explosions, and the carrier had to be abandoned and scuttled. Astoria, along with Minneapolis, New Orleans, and 4 destroyers, promptly set course for Noumea, where they arrived on May 12th. They remained there overnight before getting underway for Pearl Harbor, where they arrived on the 27th. Astoria returned to sea on May 30th, with Task Force 17 and the hastily repaired Yorktown to meet the Japanese fleet north of Midway Atoll. On June 4th, after the successful attack by U.S. dive bombers, in which 3 Japanese fleet carriers were set ablaze, Astoria stood by to defend Yorktown from the first Japanese attack, which came just after noon. The combat air patrol brought down 10 of the attackers, and Astoria teamed up with Portland and several destroyers to splash 2 more. However, 6 attackers got through and succeeded in striking Yorktown with 3 bombs. The damage to Yorktown was significant enough to force Admiral Fletcher to shift his flag to Astoria about an hour after the attack. Yorktown's damage control parties worked feverishly, and by 1:40 she was underway again under her own power. The second Japanese attack occurred later that afternoon at 2:30, and again Astoria and the other ships of the screen attempted to discourage the enemy. Every gun was brought to bear, including her main battery guns, which fired at the surface of the ocean in an attempt to throw curtains of water into the path of Japanese torpedo planes. Nevertheless, 4 made good their attacks and released their torpedoes. Yorktown dodged 2, but the other 2 scored hits. At 3 o'clock, the order to abandon ship went out. Astoria's whaleboats assisted in the rescue of Yorktown's survivors. That night, the heavy cruiser retired eastward with the rest of the task force to await dawn. Astoria remained as flagship for Task Force 17 until shortly after midday on the 8th, when Fletcher transferred his flag to the newly arrived Saratoga. After standing into Pearl on June 13th, Astoria spent the early summer at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard undergoing repairs and alterations. She subsequently carried out training in the Hawaiian operating area until early August, when she was assigned to Task Group 62.3 to cover the Guadalcanal and Tulagi landings. In the early morning hours of August 7, 1942, Astoria entered what was then known as Savo Sound, the body of water located between the island of Guadalcanal and the Florida Islands directly to the north in the southern Solomon Islands. It would soon earn a new nickname in the coming days and months, Iron Bottom Sound. Throughout the 7th and 8th, Astoria supported the 1st Division of the United States Marine Corps as they conducted amphibious landings on Guadalcanal and several smaller islands nearby. Her main battery covered the landing force, while her AA battery defended the transport vessels with vigor from multiple air attacks during both days. As evening set in on August 8th, Astoria and her sisters Quincy and Vincennes plus 3 destroyers were directed to patrol the east entrance into Savo Sound. Between 6 and 7 p.m. that evening, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, who was in overall tactical command of the amphibious force, received reports that a Japanese surface force was on the move, but the reports were vague on the number and types of ships, and calculations based on the report, which was made near noon, put them as not being able to reach the vicinity of Guadalcanal until mid-morning on the 9th. Because of this perception, the ships in both patrol groups were not on high alert or even at general quarters. At about 1:45 a.m., the destroyer Patterson, who was patrolling the southwestern entrance to Savo Sound, used her blinker signal lamps to send out the message, "Warning, warning, strange ships entering the harbor." Moments later, the Australian cruiser Canberra was savaged by a concentrated barrage of Japanese shells and was soon dead in the water and on fire from bow to stern. USS Chicago, who was also a part of the southern cruiser group, was struck by a torpedo during this time and limped away from the scene to the west without so much as firing a shot or even attempting to warn the northern cruiser group of what was coming their way. The Japanese had inadvertently divided themselves into 2 separate groups as they turned north. Astoria's captain, William Greenman, was awoken and viewed the distant flashes of the southern group getting mangled, but believed the glow of ordnance being expended 4 miles distant was from a shore bombardment, and that the underwater concussions reeling through his force were depth charges going off from destroyers battling a Japanese sub. Up until the moment of contact, no one in the northern cruiser group believed the Japanese would be in the area before mid-morning. Astoria's men raced to their general quarters stations just as searchlights from the Japanese cruiser Chokai illuminated the cruiser. Astoria's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander William H. Truesdell, identified the culprit through his spotting glasses and abruptly gave the order to commence fire. Captain Greenman, who had returned to his cabin after being roused several minutes earlier, reached the bridge shortly after Astoria's first salvo had lashed out, and fearing a friendly fire incident, ordered her gunners to cease fire. It soon became painfully apparent that his underlings were correct when the voice of his experienced and trusted gunnery officer reiterated over the intercom that the ships illuminating them were that of the enemy, and shells began splashing ahead of his cruiser. Astoria received no hits from the first 5 Japanese salvos as they worked on gaining her range, but the 6th ripped into the Achilles heel of the pre-war U.S. heavy cruisers, her amidships airplane hangar, and turned it into a blazing inferno. It also knocked out turret number 1, as 2 Japanese shells hit the turret's barbette and another ripped right through the 8-inch thick faceplate and killed almost everyone inside. Astoria was now caught in the crossfire of gunners who could see her every burning move, and in quick succession over the next few minutes, more enemy shells found her. Turret number 2 soon became jammed in place, and Captain Greenman had to order Astoria about in order to enable the turret to line up with the director's bearings. Below decks, it was a complete mess, as explosions rocked her engineering spaces, and men fell all around from toxic smoke and fumes. Astoria had only managed to reach 15 knots before her power plant began to fail from her battle damage, and soon she was a coasting inferno. At about 2:08, Astoria had to use what little forward momentum she had left to turn hard to starboard to avoid a collision with Quincy and to get herself out of the line of fire of her sister. As Astoria made this turn, she was struck by another salvo on the starboard side of her superstructure. This salvo killed several men on the bridge and brought the rest to their knees, and for a few moments, Astoria was moving through the water with no one at the helm. Captain Greenman ordered steering control shifted to Central Station and attempted to con the ship by telephone. He ordered a southerly zigzag course towards the transport anchorage, but his talker discovered the phone was dead. Before Astoria made much more progress, though, she lost all power and was dead in the water. Her last salvo then rang out from turret number 3 under local control and struck the Japanese cruiser Chokai on her forward-most turret. Just after 2:15, the Japanese fire relented as they withdrew to the north. Astoria at this point was burning from bow to stern, above and below decks, and explosions continued to ring out. Hundreds of small dramas began to play out as her men fought to save their ship, their shipmates, and themselves. A bucket brigade began battling the various topside blazes by using spent 8-inch shell casings, and many of the fires began to subside within an hour. However, the fires inside her belly were the bigger threat, and eventually her forward magazines had to be flooded to prevent a catastrophic magazine explosion from happening. Around 4 a.m., the destroyer Bagley appeared alongside Astoria and began taking on her wounded. Bagley also sent over a salvage party as well, and as the new day dawned, the destroyer minesweeper Hopkins approached and rigged a tow line to the badly burnt cruiser. The destroyer Wilson soon appeared and pulled up to Astoria's starboard side to help fight the remaining fires, and for a time, it seemed as though the ship might survive the whole ordeal. But, in the end, all the help wasn't enough, as the fires within her eventually reached her shell hoists, and a series of explosions ravaged her already weakened hull. Astoria's list to port grew considerably, and just after noon, Captain Greenman passed the order to abandon ship. She rolled onto her port side as her stern rose high in the air, and she was completely gone from sight by 12:15. Destroyers quickly moved in to pick her remaining survivors out of the water. Documentation, gathered in the immediate aftermath of the battle, reflected the names of 247 men killed or missing. These names were compiled under the worst possible circumstances, though, as they came within the confusion of the aftermath of the battle from memories of shocked survivors who were still processing the events of the previous night. The official USS Astoria website has meticulously compared the original 1942 documentation to the names and data recorded by the American Battle Monuments Commission, and has developed a list which they believe is the most accurate accounting of the men who perished aboard Astoria. 234 of Astoria's officers and enlisted men were either killed or missing and declared dead a year after the battle. Please check out the link in the description of this video for a full accounting of her men who are on eternal watch. Astoria was awarded 3 battle stars for her service in the Second World War, and the Cleveland-class light cruiser USS Astoria was renamed in her honor. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.